So there I was, Captain Marcus Rodriguez, though everyone calls me Tank because apparently subtlety isn't my strong suit, sitting in the captain's chair of the Lucky Break. And let me tell you, that name turned out to be prophetic in the worst possible way. We were humanity's first deep space exploration vessel. Which sounds impressive until you realize we were basically a tin can with delusions of grandeur and a navigation system that had clearly been designed by someone who thought close enough was an acceptable margin of error. The mission was simple. Explore the outer rim, make friends, don't start any galactic wars. You know, the usual Tuesday objectives for a species that had barely figured out how to leave their own solar system without blowing something up. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, everything. We were cruising through what our stellar cartographer, a perpetually optimistic woman named Jenkins, had marked as probably empty space, when our proximity alarm started screaming like a caffeinated banshee. And by screaming, I mean the kind of noise that makes you question your life choices and wonder if it's too late to become a farmer on some quiet agricultural world. "Captain," Jenkins called out, her voice carrying that special tone reserved for moments when you realize you've made a terrible mistake. "We've got a massive contact bearing down on us. And by massive, I mean it makes our ship look like a particularly ambitious paperweight." Before I could ask the obvious question of why we hadn't seen this thing coming, we found out the hard way. Our ship, in all its magnificent engineering glory, decided that the best course of action was to slam directly into what turned out to be a Kryllian dreadnought. Because apparently, our autopilot had been programmed by the same genius who thought it would be fun to play bumper cars in the vastness of space. The impact sent us spinning like a cosmic pinball, and through the chaos of sparking consoles and the delightful sound of hull plates groaning under stress, I caught my first glimpse of our new neighbors through the viewscreen. The Kryllian ship was a masterpiece of intimidation, all angular black metal and weapon ports that seemed to scream we were built for war and we're really good at it. Well, I announced to my crew as we finally stopped spinning, "I'm pretty sure that's not how first contact is supposed to go according to the manual." That's when the communication console lit up with an incoming transmission, and we got our first look at Commander Vex'thak. Picture, if you will. What would happen if someone decided that regular humanoids needed more teeth, more muscle, and significantly more attitude? He stood about 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like natural armor plating, with 4 arms that could probably bench press our entire shuttle, and a face that suggested he'd been carved from granite by someone who really didn't like smiling. "Human vessel," he growled in a voice that sounded like gravel being processed through a wood chipper. "You have violated Kryllian space and damaged a ship of the war fleet. Prepare to be obliterated." Showed. Now, most captains in this situation would probably start with diplomacy, maybe throw around some words like peaceful intentions and cultural exchange. But as I've mentioned, subtlety isn't really my thing. "Look, big guy," I said, leaning back in my chair with what I hoped was casual confidence rather than the pants-wetting terror I was actually feeling. "Before you start the obliterating, you should know that your coffee machine is making some really concerning noises." The silence that followed my coffee machine observation was the kind of quiet that makes you wonder if you've just said something monumentally stupid or accidentally brilliant. Given my track record, it was probably both. Vex'thak's expression shifted from immediate annihilation to something closer to confused annoyance, which I decided to count as progress. "What do you know of our sustenance preparation systems?" "Well," I said, getting up from my chair because sometimes you have to commit to the stupidity. That rhythmic grinding followed by a high-pitched whine usually means your thermal coupling is about to give up the ghost. And trust me, nobody wants to deal with a broken coffee machine when you're trying to run a warship. 20 minutes later, I found myself in the bowels of a Kryllian dreadnought, elbow deep in alien machinery that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought user-friendly was a sign of weakness. Vex'thak loomed over me, watching with what I was beginning to recognize as professional curiosity as I worked on their equivalent of a coffee maker. "There," I said, stepping back as the machine hummed back to life with a satisfied purr instead of its previous death rattle. "Good as new." "Well, good as whatever passes for new around here." Vex'thak stared at the machine, then at me, then back at the machine. "You have aided a warrior of the Kryllian Empire," he said slowly, as if he was working through some complex philosophical problem. "This creates what you humans might call a situation. A situation? A code of honor binds me. I cannot destroy one who has shown kindness to a Kryllian warrior. He paused, and I swear I could actually hear him thinking, this is most inconvenient. That's when Pip, my communications officer, decided to make her entrance. Pip is what happens when you take boundless enthusiasm, mix it with a complete inability to read social situations, and then give it access to universal translation software. Oh wow, she said, practically bouncing as she looked around the Kryllian ship. This is amazing, Commander Vex'thak. I'm Pip, and I just wanted to say that your ship's design philosophy is absolutely fascinating. The way you've integrated form and function to create an aesthetic that clearly communicates both power and purpose is just brilliant. Vex'thak blinked all four of his eyes in sequence, which I was learning was the Kryllian equivalent of being completely baffled. You find our instruments of war aesthetically pleasing? Oh, absolutely, Pip continued, apparently missing the part where she was complimenting a ship designed to turn other ships into space debris. And I've been reading about Kryllian culture during our approach, and I have so many questions. Like, how do you balance individual honor with collective responsibility? And what's the philosophical framework behind your combat doctrines? I watched in fascination as this 8-foot-tall killing machine struggled to process the concept of someone being genuinely interested in Kryllian philosophy, rather than running away screaming. It was like watching a very large, very dangerous puppy trying to figure out why someone wanted to pet it instead of flee in terror. Most species, Vex'thak said carefully, do not inquire about our cultural foundations. They typically focus on surrender terms or final requests. Well, that's just rude, Pip declared with the kind of righteous indignation usually reserved for people who cut in line at the grocery store. I mean, you're clearly a sophisticated civilization with rich traditions and complex social structures. Why wouldn't someone want to learn about that? And that's how humanity accidentally started its first interspecies cultural exchange program with a species that had been specifically engineered for warfare. Because leave it to us to make friends with the galaxy's premier warrior race by fixing their coffee machine and showing genuine interest in their murder-based philosophy. Vex'thak was clearly having some kind of internal crisis. Here he was, faced with the simple directive to eliminate trespassers, but bound by honor not to harm someone who had helped him. And now confronted with aliens who seemed more interested in cultural dialogue than conquest. It was probably the first time in Kryllian military history that someone had created a philosophical dilemma by being aggressively friendly. This is unprecedented, he finally admitted, and I could hear the genuine confusion in his voice. Perhaps temporary cooperation would be acceptable while we determined the proper course of action. 3 weeks later, I was starting to think that the universe had a seriously twisted sense of humor. Here we were, humanity's first deep space mission, and we'd somehow ended up running joint operations with a species that considered death before dishonor to be light bedtime reading. The thing is, it was actually working. Tank, Vex'thak said during one of our morning briefings, and yes, he'd started using my nickname, which was somehow both hilarious and terrifying coming from an 8-foot-tall war machine. Explain to me again this concept of tactical retreat. It's simple, I said, leaning back in my chair in what had become our improvised conference room aboard the Lucky Break. Sometimes the smart play is to run away and live to fight another day. Vex'thak's forearms crossed in what I'd learned was his thinking pose. But the code states that a warrior must never flee from battle. Ah, but see, that's where human creativity comes in. We don't call it fleeing. We call it advancing in a different direction or strategic repositioning, or my personal favorite, giving the enemy a false sense of security. I watched as he processed this information, and I could practically see the gears turning in his head. Kryllians, I'd discovered, were incredibly literal thinkers. They had protocols for everything, codes of conduct carved in whatever passed for stone on their homeworld, and a military doctrine that hadn't changed in about 1,000 years. Humans, on the other hand, treated rules more like friendly suggestions and had built our entire civilization on the principle of, let's try this and see what happens. So, Vex'thak said slowly, if I were to withdraw from an unfavorable engagement while planning to return with superior tactics, this would be acceptable. Not just acceptable, I grinned. It's smart. The best warriors aren't the ones who win through brute force. They're the ones who win by thinking 3 steps ahead of their opponents. That's when Chief Engineer Rosie Murphy chose to make her entrance, covered in what looked like a combination of engine grease and exotic alien lubricants. Rosie was what happened when you gave mechanical genius a Scottish accent and a complete disregard for the laws of physics. "Captain," she announced, "I've been working with the Kryllian engineering team, and I think I've figured out how to soup up their weapon systems." Vex'thak turned to her with the kind of interest usually reserved for discovering a new type of explosive. "Explain." "Explain. Well, Rosie said, wiping her hands on a rag that had probably seen better centuries. "Your plasma cannons are impressive, but they're running at about 60% efficiency because of thermal buildup. Now, if we reroute the cooling system and add some harmonic resonators I've jury-rigged from our sensor array, we can boost that up to about 90%. "This is possible?" Vex'thak asked, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. For a species built for war, the prospect of better weapons was apparently like Christmas morning. "Possible? Lad, I've already done it on Cannon Array 3. I want to see?" 20 minutes later, we were watching a Kryllian plasma cannon punch a hole through an asteroid that was roughly twice the size it should have been able to handle. Vex'thak stared at the destruction with what I was beginning to recognize as Kryllian joy. "Your engineer," he said to me, "is she available for adoption into our warrior clan?" I heard that. Rosie called out from where she was making adjustments to another cannon. "And I'll have you know I'm already spoken for by this bucket of bolts we call a ship." But the real breakthrough came during our first joint combat exercise. We'd encountered a group of space pirates, the kind of opportunistic scavengers who prey on isolated ships and generally make life miserable for everyone trying to make an honest living in the galaxy. Normally, the Kryllian response would have been to charge in, guns blazing, and trust in superior firepower and personal honor to carry the day. Instead, I suggested we try something different. "Okay," I said over the comm as we approached the pirate squadron. "Here's the plan. Vex'thak, you're going to do exactly what they expect. Charge straight at them, all weapons firing, full warrior mode." "This I understand," he replied. "But here's the twist. While you're keeping them busy with the frontal assault, Rosie and I are going to swing around behind them and disable their engines. They'll be so focused on the big scary Kryllian dreadnought that they won't even notice our little ship until it's too late." The plan worked perfectly. The pirates panicked at the sight of a Kryllian warship bearing down on them, exactly as we'd predicted. While they were scrambling to respond to what they thought was a typical honor-bound warrior assault, we slipped in from their blind spot and systematically disabled their propulsion systems. "Tank," Vex'thak said after we'd rounded up the pirates and were securing their ships, "this strategy of yours, it relies on deception." "Well, yeah," I said. "That's kind of the point. According to the code, deception in battle is dishonorable." I was about to launch into another explanation of human moral flexibility when he continued. "However," he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice, "the code also states that protecting one's allies and achieving victory with minimal casualties brings great honor. I believe these principles take precedence. And that's how a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of honorable combat discovered that sometimes the most honorable thing you can do is fight smart instead of fighting fair. 2 months into our unlikely partnership, we discovered that the galaxy had a problem. And by we discovered, I mean we accidentally stumbled into it while investigating what Pip had cheerfully labeled as suspicious transmission patterns in a nearby system. "Captain," she announced from her station, practically vibrating with excitement, "I've been analyzing these signals, and they're definitely artificial. But here's the weird part. They're using harmonics that suggest a hive-mind structure." "A hive-mind?" I asked, because apparently my day wasn't complicated enough already. "Yeah, like a collective consciousness. But get this. The transmission patterns suggest they're not just communicating with each other. They're broadcasting some kind of compliance frequency." Vex'thak, who had taken to spending most of his time on our bridge because apparently Kryllian ships weren't designed for casual conversation, looked up from whatever warrior meditation he'd been doing. "Compliance frequency? It's like a control signal," Pip explained, her enthusiasm dampened by the implications of what she was describing. "Something designed to override individual will and enforce obedience to a central authority." We found out exactly what that meant when we intercepted a distress call from a Zellan merchant vessel. The Zellans were a peaceful trading species, known throughout the galaxy for their neutrality and their really excellent spiced tea. When we arrived at their last known coordinates, we found their ship adrift, power systems functional, but the crew completely unresponsive. It's like they're sleepwalking, Rosie reported after we boarded their vessel. Vital signs are normal, but nobody's home upstairs. That's when we met our first representative of the Harmony Collective. Picture the most aggressively helpful customer service representative you've ever encountered. Give them telepathic abilities and a complete inability to understand the concept of personal autonomy, and you'll have a pretty good idea of what we're byly dealing with. The greetings, chaotic entities. The being said through the Zellan captain's mouth, though the voice was definitely not his own. We are the Harmony Collective. We have come to bring peace and order to your disorganized existence. Peace and order, I repeated, looking around at the zombified crew. Right. This is your idea of peace. Individual consciousness leads to conflict and suffering. The entity explained with the kind of patient condescension usually reserved for explaining basic concepts to small children. We eliminate these problems by integrating all sentient beings into our collective harmony. Resistance is unnecessary and ultimately futile. Vex'thak's response was immediate and predictable. You enslave other species. We liberate them from the burden of individual choice and the chaos of independent thought. That, I said, is the most terrifying thing I've ever heard, and I once had to explain human dating customs to a Kryllian war council. What we learned over the next few days was that the Harmony Collective had been systematically working their way through the galaxy, harmonizing any species they encountered. Peaceful races were simply absorbed into their collective consciousness. The warrior species, however, presented a problem. You can't really absorb someone whose fundamental nature revolves around individual honor and personal combat prowess, so they eliminated them instead. The Kryllian Empire is next on their expansion vector. Vex'thak informed me after reviewing the intelligence we'd gathered. My people do not know of this threat. And let me guess, I said, if we try to warn them, they're going to want to handle it with a glorious frontal assault. This is the warrior way, which is exactly what this collective is expecting. They'd probably wipe out warrior species by letting them charge heroically into overwhelming odds. I found myself in the unique position of explaining to a member of the galaxy's premier warrior race that sometimes the best way to honor your ancestors is to completely abandon everything they taught you about proper combat. Look. Yeah, I said. But Nan, your people are incredible warriors. But they're facing an enemy that doesn't fight by any rules they understand. The collective doesn't have individual soldiers to defeat in honorable combat. They have a hive-mind that can coordinate perfect strategies across thousands of ships simultaneously. Do you suggest we flee? I suggest we fight smart. Your people know warfare better than anyone in the galaxy. My people know how to think outside the box and break rules that everyone else considers unbreakable. I put those together, and maybe we can come up with something this collective has never seen before. That's when it hit me. We weren't just trying to save the Kryllian Empire. Humanity had allied itself with the galaxy's most effective military force, which meant we were now guilty by association. The collective would be coming for us too. You know what the really funny part is? I said to Vex'thak as we began planning our response, humanity has this amazing talent for making enemies out of beings we've never even met. We've been in space for all of 5 minutes, and we've already managed to get on the bad side of a galactic hive mind. Perhaps, Vex'thak replied, but you have also gained allies who were bred for war. This seems like an acceptable trade. Let's hope so, I muttered, because I have a feeling we're about to find out just how good this family of ours really is when the chips are down. Planning a battle against a hive mind, it turns out, is like trying to play chess against an opponent who can see all possible moves simultaneously and doesn't particularly care about following rules. Fortunately, we had 2 advantages: Kryllian military expertise and human stubbornness. The traditional approach, Vex'thak explained during our strategy session, would be to engage their main fleet in honorable combat, which they're probably expecting. I replied, so let's not do that. Instead, we developed what I like to call the Chaos Protocol. The basic principle was simple. If your enemy relies on perfect coordination and predictable responses, then the best strategy is to be completely unpredictable and coordinate nothing. You want us to split our forces randomly? Asked Sub-Commander Kryllian, one of Vex'thak's lieutenants who had initially been skeptical of our alliance but was now fully committed to what he called the human way of honorable insanity. Not randomly, I corrected. Independently, each ship operates on its own initiative, with its own objectives, using its own tactics. The only rule is that there are no rules. Rosie had been working around the clock to implement what she called creative modifications to both our ships and the Kryllian fleet. The results looked like something that had been designed by a committee of caffeinated engineers who had never met each other and were working from completely different blueprints. I've rigged the lucky break with a cloaking device made from spare parts and wishful thinking, she announced. It won't make us invisible, but it'll make us look like a much bigger ship that's much farther away than we actually are. And this will work? But, well, it hasn't exploded yet, so I'm calling it a victory. The Kryllian ships got even more interesting modifications. Rosie had somehow managed to turn their plasma cannons into variable frequency weapons that could switch between different energy signatures mid-battle. She'd also installed what she called tactical surprise dispensers, devices that could deploy everything from sensor scramblers to holographic decoys to clouds of reflective chaff. The beauty of this system, she explained to a group of very confused Kryllian engineers, is that even we don't know what's going to happen when we activate it. The battle itself was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Instead of the orderly engagement the Harmony Collective was expecting, they found themselves facing what could only be described as organized chaos. Vex'thak led the main Kryllian force in what appeared to be a traditional honor charge, but halfway through the attack, his ships suddenly scattered in 17 different directions, each one implementing a completely different tactical approach. Some ships deployed cloaking devices and vanished, others split into smaller formations that moved in apparently random patterns. They were away. A few actually turned around and started running away, only to circle back and attack from unexpected angles. Meanwhile, the lucky break was pulling off maneuvers that violated several basic principles of physics and at least one law of common sense. Rosie's modifications were working exactly as advertised, which is to say they were working in ways that nobody had predicted and probably shouldn't have been possible. Captain, Pip announced from her station, I'm reading massive confusion in the collective's communication patterns. They're trying to coordinate responses to about 30 different tactical scenarios simultaneously. Good, I said, trying to look confident while our ship performed what could generously be called a controlled tumble through space. You keep them guessing. The turning point came when one of our ships, the Kryllian cruiser Eternal Honor, found itself surrounded by collective vessels. According to traditional Kryllian doctrine, the appropriate response would have been to fight gloriously until death, taking as many enemies as possible to whatever passed for Valhalla in Kryllian mythology. Instead, Commander Thax inactivated every single one of Rosie's tactical surprise dispensers simultaneously. The result was spectacular. Holographic projections made it appear as though the Eternal Honor had suddenly multiplied into a dozen identical ships. Sensor scramblers convinced the collective vessels that they were surrounded by a massive fleet. Clouds of reflective chaff turned their own weapons fire back at them. And in the middle of all this chaos, the real Eternal Honor slipped away to safety. Did that actually work? I asked, staring at the tactical display. It worked so well that I'm not entirely sure how. Rosie replied, I think we may have accidentally invented a new form of combat. By the time the battle was over, the Harmony Collective had retreated to regroup and analyze what they'd encountered. For the first time in their expansion across the galaxy, they'd faced an enemy that didn't follow any recognizable patterns of behavior. Tank, Vex'thak said as we surveyed the aftermath, your species has a gift for warfare that transcends traditional understanding. We prefer to think of it as creative problem-solving, I replied. But yeah, when you back humans into a corner, we tend to get innovative. And when you ally humans with Kryllians, he continued, the results are apparently unprecedented. Looking around at the combined fleet of human and Kryllian ships, all of them bristling with jury-rigged modifications and crewed by beings who were learning to appreciate each other's completely different approaches to life, I had to agree. We'd won this battle not through superior firepower or perfect tactics, but through the power of friendship and the willingness to try things that any reasonable military strategist would have dismissed as impossible. 6 months after what the galactic news networks were calling the Battle of Improbable Victory, I found myself sitting in the newly constructed joint human-Kryllian embassy on the frontier world of New Harmony. And yes, we'd named it that specifically to annoy the collective. Sometimes the best revenge is petty revenge. Tank, Vex'thak said, settling into a chair that had been specially reinforced to handle 8 feet of armored warrior. I have received word from the Kryllian High Command. They have officially adopted humanity as a warrior clan of the Empire. Adopted us? I asked, nearly choking on my coffee. It is the highest honor we can bestow. You are now, technically speaking, Kryllians. I looked around the embassy, where human and Kryllian personnel were working side by side on everything from joint military exercises to cultural exchange programs. Pip had somehow managed to organize a Kryllian poetry reading, which was exactly as terrifying as it sounds. Rosie was teaching a group of Kryllian engineers how to make technology work through what she called percussive maintenance and creative swearing. So let me get this straight, I said. Humanity went from being complete unknowns to being official members of the galaxy's most feared warrior species in less than a year. This is correct. And all because we accidentally crashed into your ship and I fixed your coffee machine. The universe, Vex'thak observed, has an interesting sense of humor. The integration process had been interesting. Kryllians, it turned out, had very specific ideas about proper warrior behavior, most of which involved a lot more yelling and ritualized combat than humans were used to. Humans, on the other hand, had introduced concepts like casual Friday and group therapy sessions to a species that hadn't really considered the psychological implications of their honor-based society. Commander, one of the junior Kryllian officers approached our table. We have received a complaint from the human colony on Kepler 442 billion. What kind of complaint? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew. They say our honor guard is aggressively helpful and keeps trying to assist with agricultural tasks using military-grade equipment. Ah, I said. Let me guess. They offered to help with the harvest. They attempted to use plasma cannons to clear farmland more efficiently. Vex'thak's expression suggested he saw nothing wrong with this approach. Plasma weapons are highly effective at vegetation removal. Yes, but they're also highly effective at removing everything else within a 50-meter radius, I pointed out, including the crops they were trying to help harvest. Sting, though. This was the new normal. Humans trying to explain to Kryllians why you can't solve every problem with superior firepower, while Kryllians tried to understand why humans insisted on making everything unnecessarily complicated when straightforward violence was usually faster. But somehow, it was working. The joint colonies were thriving, despite occasional incidents involving overzealous Kryllian protective instincts and human teenagers who thought it would be fun to prank 8-foot-tall warrior monks. Our combined fleets had become the most effective peacekeeping force in the galaxy, partly because nobody wanted to mess with the crazy species that had somehow made friends with the Kryllians. There is something else, Vex'thak said, his tone shifting to what I'd learned to recognize as his serious voice. We have received intelligence that other species are beginning to form their own alliances in response to ours. Good alliances or bad alliances, both. Some seek to emulate our success. Others seek to counter what they perceive as a threat. I sighed. So basically, we've started a galactic arms race of friendship. It appears so. Well, I said, leaning back in my chair and looking out at the bustling embassy where 2 completely different species were somehow making it work. At least it's an interesting arms race. The truth was, we'd stumbled into something remarkable. Humanity had spent its entire history being the weird species on the outer rim. The ones nobody took seriously because we were too young and too chaotic to be considered a real threat. And the Kryllians had spent millennia being respected but isolated, feared but never truly understood. Together we'd become something new, a combination of human adaptability and Kryllian strength, of our creative chaos and their disciplined honor. We were the galaxy's most unlikely family, and we were making it work through sheer stubborn determination and a shared appreciation for really good coffee. You know what the best part is? I said to Vex'thak as we watched a group of human children playing some kind of tag game with young Kryllian warriors. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that humanity's future in space would involve being adopted by warrior monks who communicate primarily through ritualized combat, I would have suggested they seek professional help. And now? Now I can't imagine it any other way. Because that's the thing about family. It doesn't matter if your relatives are 8 feet tall, have 4 arms, and consider death before dishonor to be a casual lifestyle choice. What matters is that when the galaxy gets dangerous, you know you've got people who will stand with you, fight beside you, some probably argue with you about proper tactical doctrine while doing it. We'd started as strangers who literally crashed into each other. We'd become the galaxy's most dysfunctional and most effective family. And somewhere out there, the Harmony Collective was probably still trying to figure out how to deal with beings who had turned chaos itself into a military strategy. So, I said, raising my coffee mug in a toast, here's to humanity and the Kryllian Empire. The galaxy's newest and most dangerous family. Vex'thak raised his own mug, which was roughly the size of a small bucket and filled with something that could probably dissolve metal. To family, he agreed. May our enemies never understand us, and may our friends always forgive us. And really, when you're trying to make it work with a species that was literally designed for warfare, what more can you ask for than that?